Okay, so after finding my magnet, I'll go through the next part. So it's just saying, I've got a valve spring compressor here, which is pretty straightforward. It just has 2 bolts that go into the camshaft girdle, I forgot what they're called, girdles or retaining caps, but anyways. And then you just do one side at a time. On here, let me switch this around. I can't switch it around in the middle of the video. But on here, you can see the kind of shiny post in the middle. That's the valve stem itself. And then there's keepers here, which these springs have, I forgot the name of it, this little retaining plate. But and that retaining plate is held in place by keepers, which are little conical guys. I'm not sure if you can see that or not, but they're little conical guys that have a very slight taper to one side. And that essentially locks them in place on the valve stem. And I'll show in just a second how that works. So we'll just take one of these, actually we'll take both of these springs out. A little magnet is absolutely essential for this job. This guy here is going to push on the outside of this retaining plate. It centers kind of in the thing. And so then as I tighten it, you see there's a gap in there to allow the valve stem to move up on it. Okay, so that guy just goes in there. And then you just kind of center it as you're tightening. And then you just tighten it down until it kind of pops free. I'll show you that. And so now you can see I've got the keepers, which I can retrieve out of there with a magnet. I'm not sure where my hand is. There we go. And I always throw them out and use new ones that come with the seal kit, the gasket kit from Subaru, because you never know, with metal fatigue and everything, you don't want to risk messing up your engine for want of a several penny part. So anyways, just put this guy in here. Same thing on the other side. This time I'll try to move the camera down so you can see as I do it. Let me get that close. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's see if you can see in there as I start tightening down. Yep, you see it pops free. And then I use the magnet to scoop them out. Throw them in my little magnetic tray so I don't lose them into the engine. One of them fell down in this hole earlier, so I have to make sure that it's actually there and I don't let it roam around in the oil passages of the engine, because, you know, catastrophic engine failure is not a fun thing to go through. All right, and then these just loosen up. And we pop them out. And so I'm going to measure the height of the springs. I don't have the fancy tools needed to actually go through and measure how well they retain their compression. But now let's take a look down in here. All right, and so here you have the actual valve stem here. And if you look, I can make it move up and down just really easily with my fingers. There's a valve seal we're going to replace as well. And often that's when you start your engine in the morning and it burns some oil when you first start it, but then it clears up. That's because your valve seals are bad and it's allowing oil to go down inside the valves into the engine. The other time you'll notice it sometimes is when you're decelerating and you let off the gas. Sometimes it'll form enough of a vacuum that it'll pull oil past those valve seals as well, but mainly on cold starts. So let's just we'll flip this up on its side, and then I'll go through what happens when the camshaft pushes on the valve stems. You can see that both exhaust valves, in this case, open at the same time, and then they close at the same time. I can't do it very well with my fingers. But, and that then allows the gases to go out of the cylinder, and then through your exhaust, in this case, down through the turbo and out the downpipe. So, anyhow, I'm going to go back to a time-lapse video now. Hopefully this was helpful for somebody. I'm not sure if it's interesting or not. All right, I'm gonna go back to a non-time lapse again real quick. We'll flip this over. So we have our valves here. And I'm gonna stand it up on end and try to show you something. And I probably will fail at doing it because it's kind of hard to get the angle just right. But anyhow, let's try it. Let's do this. Okay, so I'm gonna put one of the camshafts in here and just show you how it works as it rotates. Okay, so I've got my intake camshaft, and you see how it has little bumps on it? Those are the cams, that's why it's called a camshaft. One of the things that's interesting about these Subaru shafts is they're actually hollow inside. So that keeps down the weight, which everything that rotates in the engine has a significant amount of momentum that it has to overcome when you accelerate and rev up the engine. So that keeps it light, but still keeps it straight. Keeps it strong. So let's see if I can rotate this a bit. So as this sits in place, it won't quite work because I don't have my buckets there, but we should still see it. As it rotates, you can see that it just started opening up these valves. And so then, again, I'm not sure if you can see that or not, but as it rotates around again, you can see this cylinder just opened, and then they close, and then that cylinder opens, and then they close, and that allows the fuel air charge in. So you can see there's that one, and then it's normally what the valve springs would be doing, okay? And so you can kind of see the way the camshaft works a bit. I'll go over what's going on inside there in a second. General word of advice, don't let the camshafts hit each other. All right, so I labeled all these. So I have intake 1, intake 2, that sort of thing. All right, now take all of these out. I wanted to kind of go over something real quick on these. If you guys have ever seen those Chevron with Techron, or I think there's a number of other manufacturers. But if you look at how clean those valve stems are, that's very different than the first motor I took apart, where it had carbon and gook caked up on here. Granted, it was carbureted as well, but it was caked up on here, which reduces your flow coming into the cylinder. These valves have essentially actually the valve seats have a 3-angle cut on them. So there's one angle that smooths the transition of the airflow coming into the engine. Then there's the angle that seats against the valve itself. And then there's the final angle which smooths the transition into the combustion chamber. And so let me see if I can get a decent video inside of here. And so this is where the valve guides are. Something to look for in Subaru engines, actually in most engines, is the exhaust valve will build up carbon, and sometimes it'll drag the valve guides out of the cylinder head, which is quite bad. And if we look at the exhaust valve, you see it has a lot more buildup on it. This is still not terrible compared to what I've seen. You also see it's a different color. So the heat of the exhaust gases, and this goes out through the turbo, and so that whole area stays hot. That essentially bakes the carbon that's on there. So instead of having this nice black color, you end up with this kind of chocolate brown color. And if you're burning oil, these will be a different color. There's actually a number of different things you can use. But you can kind of see that valve seat there. So I'm going to clean these up on the wire wheel on my bench grinder. But I was talking earlier about those valve keepers, and this is kind of a critical thing. Those valve keepers will sit on here like this. Oops, do I have that the right way? Remember how I said they have a very slight taper? There we go. There's one. There's the other. And they'll sit there just like that inside of the spring assembly. And so what that does is when you have your spring here, we'll get those keepers put on. Very challenging to get these on by hand. All right, and that holds that in place. And so then essentially this valve spring sits in there to push this valve closed, so that way you don't have hot combustion gases running out and burning your valves. And that can happen for a number of reasons. Happened on, I used to have a Porsche 914 that I burned one of the valves on, and maybe there's a little bit of carbon, maybe there's something else in there. But anyways, that valve was kept open, and then there's essentially a stream of high energy gas that goes and burns the like a pathway through the valve, which is not good. All right, so yeah, so intake side, the fuel injector sits here, sprays directly into the opening of the intake port, and then that gets sucked down versus into the cylinder. Burnt gases go out and then exit to go through your turbo and everything else. So that's the basics of it. Camshaft position sensor sits here to see what orientation the camshaft is at, and that way it makes sure that everything's how it should be. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. All right, I'm gonna lap these valves next, and what that does is it is gonna essentially do a small polish on the surface that contacts the valve seat on these different valves. And so I choose my valve, so this is intake valve 1, and then I'm gonna put a little bit of lapping compound on here. And what this is essentially a fine abrasive and kind of a paste. And so if you see that there, so this fine abrasive is just acting like sandpaper. And what I do is I put this into the valve, again, make sure it's in the right one, intake valve 1, and that's the front one. And I use this suction cup on some valves I've done before. The suction cup actually sticks really nicely, and these ones it doesn't, but you can still get enough traction to spin it. And so what I'm doing is as I spin it, it's rubbing that grit in between the face of the valve and the valve seat where it seats at. And so I'll just show you what happens just after even a tiny bit of it. And so if I were to clean this off, you can see it's already developed a small polished area on that valve surface. I'm not sure if that actually comes through or not, but and then it does the same thing on the valve seat. The important thing is if your valves are bent, you will not see a nice even pattern on here, because essentially one side will be contacting, the other side won't. So that's one thing I like to look at kind of early on to make sure that it's fully seating. But then also if you have any debris built up on that valve seat, it won't, it'll take a while to cut through. And you can hear that change. So it went from that real gritty to real fine. And that's essentially, we've displaced the grit to the outsides of that. And so then we just pull the valve up a little bit. It allows it to seat again. And we go until it's quiet. And kind of like when you, if you have granite countertops or anything like that, and you've ever like cleaned them with a sponge, you feel the grit go away as they get clean. And so it's the same sort of thing here. As you clean up those seats and the valve, you feel it get cleaner. Hard to describe. It's a little bit by sound, a little bit by feel. And then what I do is, after I've done this for a bit, is I'm going to do a light check. And so it's real low tech. But so I clean that valve off, get all the grit off of there. You can see it's got a pretty nice pattern on it now. Do the same thing for the valve seat. I look first to see if there's any obvious high spots, which will show up as shiny spots. And there's a few little ones, but nothing serious. And put the valve back in place. And then I shine a light into that port. You can see how bright it is there. But you can, in fact, I can see it right here. There's a little tiny bit of light coming through. And I know this won't show up on the video, but I'll try it anyways. So there's a little tiny bit of light coming through on one part of the valve seat. And so it looked like it had ground it down really nicely, but it still has a ways to go. And that's very much a, I don't know what to tell you, like an experience thing to be able to see that tiny bit of light. You got to get your eye at the right place because it's going to reflect off of the port. And yeah, so it just takes a bit of practice. But the better test that I usually do is to let these soak with water in them with all 4 valves in there after they've been done, and with the spark plug in as well. And what that does is any water that would drip down into a specific port, you'll see a little tiny pool of it, maybe just a single bead, and that will let you know that it's leaking out of that specific valve. And then you can lap it a little bit more. In this case, I don't yet have my spark plugs, but with the light method, you get pretty close. And so, but it's kind of amazing how much space there would be. I'll show you on one of the valves before I do it, but how much space there is on valves that haven't been lapped. And so, and this is like, you start losing compression, you can burn a valve. You can have a number of ills from this. So I want to just look around and see if there's any obvious high spots. Again, I'm going to put I like using my phone's flashlight. It works pretty good. So I just shine that in there. And also make sure you're not trapping grit. Because that little, even a single piece of grit will lift up the valve enough that you won't be able to see. So that now doesn't have any light leaking past it. So that's pretty good. And let me show you, let me find my intake valve 2. Yeah, there we go. And I'll show you what it looks like without lapping. Maybe these have a good match. No, they don't. Okay, and this is why you lap valves. So, all right. Can you see that light coming through? Maybe not. Yeah, I can't see it in the camera, so I'm not sure if it shows up. But there's a little hairline of light that's coming through on that valve, and let's see. Wish I could find it on here because it looks pretty cool, but that lets you know that that's just not sealing quite right. It's not terrible, but it's also not good. So we'll lap that one next. I'm gonna go back to time lapse.